Hello everyone, it's your favorite writer, Catherine York. Okay, let's start. We have an editing checklist for today. So you can do two types of revision to your story. One is you work on your plot, your story, and the other one is you work on your writing and the text and everything. So today we're gonna go through the editing checklist for your story, particularly for your plot, how you develop it, if you have any mishaps that you need to fix. So grab a notebook, grab a pen, and I will help you out. We can do this together. I'll explain along the way what you need to really pay attention to. So yeah, let's start. So number one, you have the week opening, the week ending. So last time in my video, mistakes you can do in the first chapter, you can go and check it out. I explain what you really need to work on when it comes to your beginning on the story and why the first chapter is really important to your story. As for week ending, it really comes down to if you have wrapped up everything in the end, any plot twists that you might have opened up during the story, you want to close them down. You want to make sure that everything is explained, everything makes sense at the end of the story. It's not just jumbled up in the last chapter, but you have, let's say for the last 3 chapters, you have explained everything that was missing in your story, everything that was confusing, any questions, everything just slowly coming together. For the last chapters, that is a satisfactory ending, and your reader who is reading the story will have that sense of relief and content that everything just makes sense in the story and it feels completed. So the next thing that I want you to pay attention to is the lack of development for the story and for the character. Now, separately. So I'm not really going to talk about the other stories as well, like particularly because my forte is romance, right? So I'm going to talk about the romance stories in general, but I guess you can kind of also use this for other stories like drama, thriller, whatever. I mean, the whole point is like if your main characters are leading the story or if your plot is reading the story. When it comes to romance, usually romance is the plot, right? That is the main goal you're trying to achieve here is the romance. However, one thing that I do think that it makes the story a bit more special and it gives it a little bit more depth and complexity is when you have other things that your characters want to achieve in the story despite the romance. I feel like that makes the story a bit more better. So let's say if you're writing a fantasy story, of course adding a bit of romance in there is only going to spice up the story. If you're writing a romance story, adding a bit of mystery, suspense is gonna make your story better. So when I work on my stories for romance, I always make sure my characters have in the individual growth and they have situations that they need to handle apart from their romance story. So let's say they have some sort of fight with their family and now they have to resolve it, or they are not sure what to do about their dreams and then they figure it out. So with that, I also try to develop the plot, because while they're growing outside of their romance and we have like situations in which the main characters can support each other and add with their specific growth aside, they can contribute something to the romance, the relationship, their conversation. It just makes everything seem a lot more real and it just makes everything feel complete. So yes, I do think that in order to spice up the plot, you need to add like elements of other stories as well. So let's say you have to add suspense to your romance story or mystery, but yes, also it's all about how you engage with your reader in the story and what you make them focus on. As for the character development, like I said, you want to give them maybe something that's outside of their relationship, or if the whole purpose of the story is their growth, you want to give them something else like romance, maybe of new friendships. So yes, I think like a bit of more complexity is gonna make all the better, as well as making your character realize a certain something about themselves. So when they learn they learn a specific lesson, or they have overcome some of their fears maybe or insecurities, at the end of the story you want them to have changed in a way, maybe changed for the better. I'm also gonna add that when you're developing the story, you want to give your characters chances for improvement. So you might want to give them situations in your story in which they have to face their fears, and maybe you have them fail at first, but then they maybe gather the courage or they learn something along the way from their friends or their relationship, and they realize what it was that it's important, like to move forward or take a risk or something, and then you see them grow the next time you give them the opportunity to prove themselves. You see them grow. So I think that the plot and the characters should feed each other, as well as you as a writer. I feel it's important if you put in some of your own lessons that you want to teach the reader, or give them a specific message that you want them to understand at the end of the story. I think overall it's gonna make the story better. Next, we have too much information or too little information. Now, I have mentioned at the beginning of any chapter that too much information is probably gonna overflood the character, but in this situation I'm not talking about too much information about the story. I'm particularly talking about things that we put in the story unaware that we have put them in the story and that they are unneeded. So when it comes to putting too much information, what I mean by this, let's say your characters are having a conversation about something, and maybe it has to do like with you presenting your characters, maybe why they have a fear of bugs or why they have a fear of heights or something, you know, giving it a backstory. But at the end of the day, if you can read your story, right, and then your story will make complete sense even if you remove that conversation, that little backstory, it means it's unneeded in the story. It's a filler. So this is a bit hard because sometimes I write something and I feel like, oh, this will explain a lot of things, but then I reread the story and I'm like, this is unneeded, like this is uncalled for. Like you can understand by the end of the story why the character behaves this way or why the character did this decision. So I just removed any unnecessary parts. It's really hard since, let's say I have maybe 10 pages written about something about this, and then it's really hard when you have to delete everything. But if it's for the best of the story, you have to kill it off, you have to cut it off. I want you to go and Google Chekhov's gun. This is a really interesting thing I think you can learn about writing, is that the whole thing about Chekhov's gun, that they explain it, it's like a principle in which if you put a spotlight, if you put an object in a spotlight, that object needs to be important and you should come back to it maybe later on in the story. Like, you know, like foreshadowing, the whole principle is that you shouldn't do false foreshadowing. Like if you point something out, it better matter, right? It better be important. As for missing information, sometimes in order to create suspense in the story, we skip important details in the story that we need to add. So while trying to maintain a mystery, you end up not giving your reader enough information for them to understand the story, so they get lost or they don't understand the ending because sufficient information has been taken from them. Even though you want to create a bit of mystery maybe or suspense in the story, I feel like you should pay attention to how much information you're hiding from the reader, because sometimes they need more explanation throughout the whole story and not just at the end when you're revealing everything, because sometimes the reader wants to keep up with the story and understand that, and they will go back and reread some things. They will try to understand it, especially if they're invested in the story. God bless those readers. But yes, if they're invested in the story, of course they will try to think about everything, and if it doesn't make sense, it will only confuse them at the ending. So you want to make sure that you have not pulled back a lot of things. Next one, we have pacing, the pace. This is an interesting topic for me, the pacing. So you have pacing that it can be fast pacing and you have slow pacing. It really depends on the genre, but fast pacing is mostly done with romance and comedic stories and lighthearted stories, while slow pace is usually used for more complex stories. Because why? Fast-paced stories are those you can read in one breath, like 3 to 4 hours, right? You sit down, you read the whole story. While slow-paced books are kind of more complicated. You have to sit back and think about certain things. Maybe you have too much information that you have to process. These are usually the psychological thrillers, the dramas, you know, like kind of harsher and more complicated books to read. So you need more time to absorb all the information as a reader. So that's why your story is going to have a slower pace. Now, I particularly am a fast-paced writer. What I recommend for you to do is to first figure out if you want to be a fast-paced writer or a slow-paced writer. Now, I have grown up reading fast-paced stories, and I knew right away that I wanted to be that type of writer that readers can just like pick up a book and then want to read it in a few hours. They want like start and finish in one day. That's the type of writer I wanted to be. So because of that, I knew that I have to study up on how to write fast-paced stories. Now, I will give you a tip on how to speed up the pace in your story. One of those tips is you can you end your chapters with a cliffhanger. That doesn't give the reader any time to pause it or leave the story, because now they want to know what's going to happen in the next chapter. So they have to start reading the next chapter. And if you end the next chapter as well in a cliffhanger, they have to read the next chapter. So you want to kind of like play along with that. A fast-paced story doesn't have to mean having a lot of scenes in the story. I read a lot of scenes in the story, but you can actually write a fast-paced story, let's say with 2 main characters in one room, and nothing has to change. The scene doesn't have to change. They will still be in that room, but you can write a whole book about it. And still make it fast-paced. So that's not really the whole problem here. It's all about the way you're writing a story and how much information and complexity you're giving to your writing. As well as for slow-paced stories, if you're writing something more complicated, of course the reader would need more time and maybe a few days to really understand the story. So yes, after you've really figured out what type of writer you are and what effect you want to have on the readers, you can do a bit more research or how you want your pacing to be like. A problem here that might show up would be if you're doing a too fast of a pacing or too slow of a pacing. How long you write a certain scene, if it has unnecessary details, the scene would feel too slow. If the scene has too little details, it will move too fast for the reader, for them to really understand or feel a certain emotion when you're writing. Okay, next one is illogical behavior of your characters. This is very important to pay attention to. Now when you're rereading your story or when you're starting to write, you want to pay attention to unnecessary different behaviors in the characters that are uncharacteristically for them. So if you have a character that is scared, let's say it's a coward, maybe it's a side character, and this character is a coward, or it always gets others into problems. Unless it's for character development in which you give this specific character a chance to develop and become somebody who actually solves problems instead of create problems for others. Unless you're going for that growth part, you shouldn't put this character into a situation when they're actually doing something that's outside their characters. So if you want this character to remain the coward that it is, you want to avoid putting them in a situation in which they act like a leader or they act like a problem solver. If you're creating, let's say, a main lead in which they are strong and independent and they understand that they're very smart and they're very problem-solve driven, you can never put a phrase in which they say, "Oh no, what do we do now?" Because if it's a character that solves problems, they will never ask others to solve that problem for them. So using a phrase like, "Oh no, what do we do now?" it's gonna be uncharacteristic for that character, right? Make sure that all of your characters make sense. If you have a bubbly, supportive character or a motherly or a mother in the group type of friend character in the story, you don't want to make them make reckless decision or say something insensitive to the main character, because it's just not who they are. So sometimes for the sake of the plot we write stuff like this, but I feel like it's really important that we avoid. You have to make sure your the phrases, the dialogue that you use for the characters actually fits their character. Okay, so next one is something I want you to pay attention to is confusion in your story. Something that can confuse the readers. Now, particularly this happens when you're writing a scene that you're not really familiarized with. When it comes to romance, if you don't read a lot of stories, let's say, where there is gunfights or fights in general or war, when it comes to writing at your own in your own story, it's gonna be a bit of a problem because you're not used to reading it, you don't have the right words, or you wouldn't know how to properly explain it. And this happens a lot when we want to write a fight scene in a romance story and we're not really good at it, especially if you don't have experience in fighting in real life, or you have read a lot of things about them. It's gonna be kind of confusing for the writer to write that and for the reader to read that. I've seen a lot of jokes about this on TikTok, BookTok, where they joke about not being able to understand who hits who where or who kicks with what where. You know what I mean? It confuses them. So I would either suggest you to either do a lot of research on this before writing the scene, or you avoid going too much into details and too much into explaining who hits what where. If you're writing a medical scene, you want to make sure you do proper research, otherwise it's gonna get, it might annoy a lot of people if they have knowledge in that situation. So if it can be avoided, yeah, try to get yourself tangled up in all these explanations, because it can create a confusing scene for the reader. Another thing that can show up, and this is very important, write it down, is when you're writing confusing scenes, when you're trying to monologue about your character's thoughts. It could be done in first POV, it could be done in third POV. It can still be complicated when you're writing a certain monologue. Unusual, normal pattern of thinking in a normal human, right? Your friends, it usually goes very up and down. So you start thinking by, oh, I saw my crush today, he looked so good in that sweater, to, did I eat today something for lunch? Yeah, I ate something for lunch. Oh yes, but I did saw my crush. Oh, I just hope he notices me. Why am I always like this? See, it goes up and down. It goes from insecurities to your crush to this emotion and that emotion. It just gets so tangled up. Let's give you a concrete situation. You have a character that is scared to fall in love because they've been hurt by their ex-boyfriend, right? So now you have a new, let's say, lead in your story. And they support the other main character, they are lovely to them, but this first main character is still scared to fall in love. Now we have let's say suddenly their ex shows up, right? And we have a thought pattern that needs to happen here. They're a little inner monologue. So in order to avoid confusion here, to avoid confusing the readers, their thought pattern should be into segments. So first is their current situation, their insecurities, right? They're thinking about their insecurities. And then they're thinking about their ex-crush that has just shown up, or their ex-boyfriend that has just shown up, and how they hurt them and how they feel that they're confused maybe. And then we have them thinking about the new person in their life and how much that has impacted them maybe. So they have that thought pattern. And then lastly, it should be the realization that that character comes to, because it shouldn't be just a pointless monologue, the inner monologue, without them coming to a realization. So yes, at the end of that little monologue, they should realize, oh wait, maybe I actually don't care about this ex-boyfriend anymore, and now I like this new person. Something like that. It could be split into few sections. It doesn't have to be like one long paragraph. It could have a little bit of dialogue in between. But when we have these like little segments, it's easier for the reader to follow the story. So you might want to watch out for that. Sometimes I write like a whole damn long scene with dialogue and everything, and I think it's perfect, and then I go back reading it after a few days and I have no idea myself what is going on. So I realized that I have to like switch up a few paragraphs up and down so they make a lot more sense. Next thing I want you to watch out for is timeline errors. Now this can happen when we're writing something. This can happen if you're writing something for like a longer period of time, if the age gaps doesn't match whatever previous year you have mentioned. When it comes to like longer periods of time when it has passed and you have to reflect back on them. Let's say you're writing a fantasy story and you're writing like 300 years ago this happened, and then, or 50,000 years ago, or 70 years ago, and your character has to match the age. You have to make sure that the numbers line up. Once I got mixed up in all of this and realized it can be very touchy and sensitive if you do not get the years right and it's all confused. So you want to make sure everything makes sense in that thing, as well as any confusion in the story. Like sometimes I would write something about the characters in the first pages. Maybe I would say, oh, like I have done this, like I would write something about a character, but then I change my mind as the story progressed, or I think that maybe I didn't mention this and now I create another scene in which I mentioned this, even though I mentioned it in the first chapter. So now there is like two situations in which this has happened. Like recently I've read a manga in which the author herself explains that she totally forgot that she already introduced two characters together. So then she redid that in another scene and everybody was like, wait, I thought that already met. And it was like, I mess this up, because yes, they have already met, and a lot of her editors of course missed that as well. So that can happen. And what I'm trying to say in your story, you want to make sure that you have maybe not left out something or explained something and then change your mind in another scene. I have done this mistake, of course, like it happens to the best of us. But yes, it's just something to have in mind when you're editing your story, it's particularly because when you're gonna write something in the first chapter, I'm pretty sure you're gonna change your mind about it and you're gonna write something else in the last chapter. So you always have to make sure that the first chapters match whatever is happening on the last chapter. And the last one is unresolved plot threads. Unresolved plot threads, I think I already mentioned this, that you want to make sure that you have wrapped up everything in the last few chapters. You don't want to leave everything out. Sometimes we leave parts out, so like, oh, you can explain them in part 2, but unless it's done subtly and the reader doesn't notice this, I think you should avoid doing this, because you never know if you're really going to write a part 2. So I feel like everything should be wrapped up and done into novel 1, the book, it's finished. The story is gonna be overall more successful if you have resolved everything in the last chapters. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please give it a like, subscribe, leave a comment down below, share this video to another writer friend, and yes, see you in the next one.